Elton. I'm so excited to finally get to meet you and talk to you. This is
Me too.
Elton.
I'm really excited too. Fantastic to see you and to hear you.
Well, thank you. So Elton Barker, everybody from the Open University, and we're here to talk about Homer's Iliad and things having to do with Homer and the Iliad and the Trojan War and whatever Elton feels like talking about. So, all right, I'm very interested in what you have to say about swift-footed.
Well, that's what before. Just to rewind and say, we were off camera, as it were. We were talking. You were talking about scansion, and you were talking about trying to find the melodies, the voices for these different characters. And that had actually got something ringing in my mind, kind of making me think again of something that Joel and I had written about in our beginner's guidebook to Homer, where in that final chapter we talk about reception, and we kind of push the boat out a little and think not in terms of direct reception a lot of the time, but thinking of comparable ways of thinking about, looking at a contemporary genre and thinking about how that can help us rethink Homer and Homeric epic. And the genre that we particularly like playing with is science fiction, because science fiction is this about this other time, this other place, and that's very much what epic is. Epic is about this other time, this other place. Literally, it's this race of heroes, the generation before ours. And by being in this other time and other place, as we know from science fiction, that can help you address some really live, urgent issues that concern the community. But I'll come back to that in a second. But my point here to talk about science fiction is that the science fiction series we were really into at the time, and I totally blame Joel for this. We started watching this in a literally a waterlogged basement in New York. He was a grad student at the time. Obviously, his accommodation wasn't great, and he had this kind of rather sketchy carpet anyway. And then this sketchy carpet was about a foot underwater. Then some particular storms that hit just as I was visiting. But to kind of get over this, he introduced me to this series called Battlestar Galactica. And the reason for me to raise that now is that, and you see this in other series too, in other films, you get musical cues when certain characters turn up. And what you were talking about reminded me precisely of those musical cues, where you instantly just a couple of notes is enough to get you to think about the character and to not only to prepare you for the character coming on stage, as it were, again, but to remember the previous appearances of that character in the series. I mean, it's such a beautiful mnemonic in a way to kind of get you to remember the kind of the baggage that these characters are coming with. And that actually, I hadn't planned this at all, as you can probably tell by this rambling, but that is actually quite a good way into thinking about the way in which Homer's language works. So I don't, like I said, when you started talking about finding this, finding a melody for the characters, that really chimed with me, as it were, to pardon the pun. But a sense of the language of Homer being, but kind of working in a similar way, where you get these phrases repeated over the course of both epics, the Iliad and Odyssey. What scholars would call formula. So typical ones would be rosy-fingered dawn, for example, or to describe particular characters. Much turning, Polytropos, Odysseus, this kind of thing. These key us into certain moods, whether with dawn, for example, breaking, whatever, or to prepare us for certain characters and to remember who those characters are. And that leads me into what I really want to kind of talk about with the beginning, the Iliad, is when we're introduced to Achilles. Now it's the Iliad. So one thing I want to try to one I guess the main point I want to try to put across briefly, if I can, is the aspect of traditionality, and how these poems are the product of centuries and centuries of performance, and a performance of all different songs about heroes, some of which would have been about the Troy story, and some of which may even been about Achilles and his anger. So there's going to be lots of stories around, and the Iliad is, if you like, rather than how we tend to think of it as the beginning of things, the beginning of Western literature, as it tends to be called, it's actually the end of things. It's the end of this oral tradition, the Iliad and Odyssey. So there's this tradition, there's this inherent traditionality in the story patterns, in the type scenes, the certain phrases, the very language of Homer. But there's also what I want to really put across is excitement, surprise, unusual elements. And we see this right from the beginning of the Iliad, where this was always a nice conundrum at our students as kind of an icebreaker. Who's the first speaker of the Iliad? And you get the list: Achilles, Agamemnon, Zeus, Hera. Very few people remember that it's this old guy Chryses. So, which is, I think, already a really interesting take on the Troy story, in that you give the first speech to somebody who's not a main hero, the main protagonist. He has to be introduced to us, which is unusual. You don't get an introduction to Agamemnon or any of the others. We get introduced to Chryses as if, we're not sure who this person is. And he's not what you might say archetypally a heroic figure. Although maybe that's debatable, because what he does is really quite heroic. He goes to the enemy camp to plead for his daughter's return. But it's this old man, a very frail figure, who is the first person speaking to us. Of course, there's an authority, there's a power behind that frailty, because he carries with him, as Homer's very sure to make us aware of, he carries with him the trappings of the priest. He's a priest of Apollo, so there's a power of the god behind him. But nevertheless, giving the first speech to this, what we might say a marginal character from the other side, I think is a really interesting take. And that leads, I think, quite nicely, and trying to bring both points together now with what I really want to talk about, which is swift-footed Achilles. So we know this epithet, swift-footed Achilles. It's as familiar as Polytropon Odysseus. This is Achilles, Podas Orcus Achilleus. So this swift-footed Achilles, who we can imagine, we can imagine the reasons why he has that epithet. It's because he's quick on the battlefield. Why is that important? Well, presumably to be a great warrior, it helps in those days to be quite fleet of foot, to be quite quick. So this is really an epithet that's about his heroic career. It's a kind of a signal. It's one of those musical cues about who Achilles is, how important he is in the as this figure fighting on the battlefield in front of Troy. And yet, the first instance of swift-footed Achilles in the Iliad, do you know when that is? Just another teaser for the audience.
I do not. And while we're at it, compare it to short-lived Achilles, the other epithet.
Oh, okay. You've already anticipated one of the things I was going to say. Brilliant. Fantastic. Okay. Absolutely. We were talking about Thetis before, and Laura Slatkin's brilliant book. So yes, absolutely to go there. I'll try to remember to come back to that. But this idea of swift-footed Achilles at this point comes in line 58. So right at the beginning there of the Iliad, when we really see events go very quickly at the beginning. As you'd imagine, Homer trying to grab his audience's attention. So not only do we get him spring a surprise from us from the beginning with introducing this new character, this marginal character on stage, but things really go quite bad for the Achaeans after this figure Chryses is sent away by the king, Agamemnon. Apollo, as you can imagine, gets quite angry, sends a plague down on the Achaeans. And it's in this context we first see Achilles. Achilles calls an assembly. So I want to come back to that in a second too. But after telling us that Achilles calls an assembly because Hera put the thought in his mind, so right from the beginning, you've got the gods' involvement, and that's really quite important for helping us figure out where we are in the cosmos in terms of, you know, the kind of the cosmic plan of Zeus, you know, with in Hesiod's Theogony, we have the Zeus coming to power, and the reasons why Zeus is now in power and why he's always going to be in power. You know, it's quite important that the gods aren't fighting anymore for us humans. And the Iliad positioning itself very much in that world where we get gods interacting with mortals, this heroic race of men. So Hera puts the idea in Achilles' mind. But as Achilles gets up to speak, Homer describes him as swift-footed. Now, of course, one way of thinking about this is it's because the language of Homer is so traditional, you know, and swift-footed is one of the ways in which one describes Achilles, and because Homer is composing in performance, it's a thing that he needs to fit the end of the line. So he's running to the end of the line and shit, I've got to describe Achilles somehow. It's not good enough to say Achilles. He's got to be, you know, something Achilles. So swift-footed Achilles. And you know, that's fine. You know, it helps draw attention to the oral aspect of Homer's composition. But there's something also, I think, very important going on here, and that goes back to the idea of musical cues. So we hear swift-footed Achilles, and we think, or we remember all the times when Achilles has been swift-footed. So what I mean is, we as members of the audience, we come to a performance of the Iliad, bringing with us this knowledge, essentially being able to understand the baggage that each of these, you know, main known characters, the characters with epithets, come with them when they come, you know, when we see them enter on Homer's stage. So this cues us in to thinking of the moments when Achilles is swift-footed, which of course is in battle. And so what we get is a disjunction. We get dissonance. It doesn't quite fit because he's not being swift-footed. He's standing up to speak. But this for me is the absolutely key point where we get the idea of surprise embedded within this broader context, this framework of traditionality. So we get Achilles swift-footed, getting up to speak. We're unsettled. You know, we realize the importance of Achilles as, you know, the main hero of the Achaeans, the main hero of the Achaeans because he beat up so many Trojans. Yet here he is getting up to speak in the assembly. And what I would argue is happening here, we get that dissonance, that disjunction. It's a surprise, and it also puts emphasis on this particular act that he's doing, setting up an assembly. And he's setting up an assembly as a direct response to the crisis facing the community. You know, and essentially that's why he calls the assembly. It's why Hera puts the thought in his mind. It's his opening question. Can anyone here speak and tell us what's going wrong? You know, why are we all suffering? Of course, seems to be a bit of a vacuum here. Why isn't it Agamemnon, who's, you know, the so-called leader of men, you know, the shepherd of the people? Why is he not calling an assembly? And that I think is interesting. You might think that the way that the assembly is called, with it being put in Achilles' mind, and the fact that he lays down the conditions for speaking in the assembly and speaking the truth in the assembly. So very importantly, you get the second speaker, Calchas the seer. Being a seer, he knows what the problem is. But very importantly, Calchas says, I know, but I'm not going to tell you unless you protect me, because I'm going to anger someone who's more powerful than me. And we might have our doubts about this. But of course, we have just seen someone not very powerful being sent away by the king. So actually, there's that hangover from that first episode too, when Agamemnon sent away Apollo's priest, Chryses. Now we have Calchas, the Achaean seer, pretty much saying, what I'm going to say is going to anger, someone. So will you protect me? And Achilles guarantees protection. Now, of course, what then happens subsequently is a big quarrel, a big strife between Achilles and Agamemnon. But nevertheless, I think we see here the foundations of the assembly as a place where people can speak and speak the truth to power being set up. And it's very interesting that later on in the epic, so what I would say is that the epic evolves as we understand and get used to its kind of patterns, its semantics, its kind of interpretive framework. Later on in the assembly of Book 9, another critical assembly, because the Achaeans by this point are hemmed in. Achilles hasn't been fighting. I'll come back to that in a second. Agamemnon's ready to give up on Troy seriously this time. Book 2, he was just kidding. Now he's ready to give up on Troy. And Diomedes speaks in return. And the first thing he says is, I'm going to speak, Agamemnon, and you don't get angry. So we see Diomedes appealing to the precedent that Achilles establishes in this first assembly in Book 1, the ability to speak up and speak the truth and to speak back and speak truth to power, as it were. So all this is being cued by just that phrase, by that musical cue of swift-footed, in that this is going to be a really important aspect of what this Troy story is about. Yeah, sure, we're going to get the fight against the Trojans, we're going to get Achilles and Hector, all of that, but we're also going to get political strife. We're also going to get fighting among the Achaeans, and that's also been, by the way, foregrounded in the very proem, in the very opening lines, where Homer gets his chance to trail what the Iliad's going to be about. He talks about Achilles being angry. Yeah, fair enough. He's a big heroic figure. They get angry. That's kind of what epic's all about. Angry, sends the souls of heroes to Hades. Okay, I was expecting something a little bit jollier. I don't know, something about beating people up. And then it's not just any old souls, it's the souls of the Achaeans, so his own side being sent to Hades. So from the beginning, Homer complicates this story about Troy, the siege of Troy, the fight to get Helen back, Greeks, Achaeans versus the Trojans. It's going to be about that, but perhaps not so much about that as about conflict between the Achaeans themselves. And that instantly makes the whole idea of conflict much more interesting, much more difficult, much more engaging. So all of the, and like I said, this goes back to that simple cue, swift-footed. And this is one other point I want to make here, and that is we do get swift-footed Achilles later. So we get, if you like, the tension here, the dissonance being resolved. We're going to see swift-footed Achilles in action, but we're going to have to wait an awfully long time. For most of the epic, Achilles isn't swift-footed. He's not moving at all. He's by ships, stilled. And that is just so important for thinking about the dynamics of this tale. And when we do get swift-footed Achilles, wow, it's really impactful. He slaughters hundreds of Trojans, line by line by line, Trojan warriors falling. You get these brief descriptions by Homer of the lives that they had led before, very poignant, very pathetic. He fights the river. He fights the river because he's killed so many Trojans. He's that good. We then see him being led off by Apollo, another swift-footed character, leading Achilles away from Troy for a bit. So we get a bit of a break. And then, of course, we get the main, what we've been waiting for all this time, Achilles and Hector. But it's noticeable that at that point, swift-footed Achilles isn't swift enough. He's not able to catch up with Hector, actually. It takes the gods, again, to come down and to stop Hector running. And only then do we see Achilles and Hector face off. All this just from that line, line 58 of book one, swift-footed Achilles stands up to address the assembly. That's what I think, anyway.
Well, I love how as soon as he said, swift-footed Achilles, and he's speaking rather than fighting, the first thing that I was chuckling to myself about was, yes, him chasing Hector 3 times around the Trojan walls was the first thing that my vision of him, like, running. And speaking about hidden things that we were talking about before I pressed record. Uh, People love to love Hector, right? But they also either don't pay attention, never read the Iliad. Frankly, when people talk about the Trojan Wars, I feel like they never read the Iliad, so they right away think things like Hector is always just so fabulous and never cowardly, and Achilles, man killer. And I'm like, oh, Achilles, the sweet mama's boy who prayed to his mother and asked for help. Achilles, who played the lyre to his, sweet companion Patroclus. And people love to say Patroclus, Patroclus, never somebody who's always wonderful. I'm like, Patroclus, slept with at least one woman in Iliad that I can think of in the scene, almost surely a slave girl, like, just we assume, but maybe not. Um, because he's in, I can't remember which book, but he's in one room with one girl, and Achilles is with another, and Patroclus, who himself, kills people because he's also a soldier that people don't even sit and think about. Um, and Hector, our guy, yes, he's a fabulous. We love the scene where he's a father, and and Andromache says, "You're my father. You're my family. You're my everything." Right? Because all my family had been killed already. Um, um, but Hector, also the same guy who was so scared of Achilles, he ran around the Trojan walls 3 times. Like, he didn't turn around and stand his ground and whatever, to battle this guy who came invading his land. He was scared. And when the moment came to fight the guy after 10 years, he ran 3 times. And one would assume the Trojan walls were huge. So these are the hidden things, right, that humanize these characters, actually, that make them complicated, that make them more than one dimensional. These are the things that people don't like to remember because they tend to like a simple character trait attached to someone. They like swift footed Achilles uh, being the chaser, but not Achilles who stood up and called together an assembly necessarily. At least the sweet Patroclus, the brave Hector, they are multidimensional, and there's something.
I think that's yeah, that's absolutely right, and that's what makes them so interesting and so real. And one reason why the epic still has so much to say, because Homer doesn't shy away from those uglier aspects. It's not a woke epic in that sense. It's not going to hide things away. It's going to confront them, and and it does so in some very in brutal fashion, particularly when Achilles is on that rampage, when he's suddenly, when eventually at long last he's fulfilling what it means to be swift-footed. We are then shown the full horror of what that means, and again, it's even more effective. It's even more horrific because we've been made to wait so long. And in many ways, we become implicated in that because we've wanted the excitement of listening to our hero beat up the Trojans. And then finally we get that. We get what we want, and it's bloody and it's awful. And that's really interesting how Homer's definitely playing with the dynamics of audience expectation and participation there. Where we get the full horror, particularly where you get scenes of supplication that Achilles, because he's so angry at that point with the death of Patroclus that he's not going to accept any supplications at all, and that then just puts into even greater relief which is kind of the echo scene of that first scene, when Priam, a similarly marginal old man, goes to supplicate again the powerful king for the return of his child, although this time, of course, the return of the child, it's the return for the body of the child. The child is no longer alive. Hector is dead, so that's already quite it's both a reminder of the beginning and also a sense of poignancy and depth, a sense of loss because of what this particular supplication will be about. And yet it's also a scene of humanity. I mean, and that's really, again, what I said before about how Homer doesn't shy away from these things. The description he gives of Priam kissing Achilles' hands, where he describes those hands as man slaughtering. And they're man slaughtering because he's obviously killed many men, but more particularly the man slaughtering because he's killed Hector, Priam's son. And it's interesting that Hector himself had that epithet. Hector was known when he was alive as man slaughtering. So that transferred epithet there is doing a lot of work and really drawing us into the ties between two figures who seem to be just so far apart. And so much of that final scene, incidentally, without the presence of the gods. So we see here, even the Iliad is moving on now from a world in which the gods are interfering all the time to a world where, okay, they're still there, they set things up, but Hermes is very specific. And I'm not going to hang around here. This is not for me. This is about death. And that sense of death and mortality, humanity, is really very strong, I would say, with that ending. And nothing rosy here. It's about two figures coming together with over a dead body, but nevertheless, it's really very touching and very moving, I'd say.
The beginning and ending of the Iliad is really something. When you take a look at its beginning and its ending, the beginning, the wrath, and then the ending, I forgot exactly the final word, but it is the funeral of Hector and the three women lamenting for him, his mother, his wife, and Helen being the last one to lament for him. And we have the grief, we have the wrath of Achilles in the beginning, and then 10 lines right after it's Apollo's wrath, right? The wrath of Achilles and the wrath of Apollo, really. And then the end is that very human grieving. But there was something that actually came to mind: horse taming Hector, right? When horse taming
last line, that's right, yeah.
When horse taming Hector is gone, the Trojan horse comes, and I just thought it's really, kind of interesting, right? I don't know. It just.
Well, that's absolutely
right. Trojan horse comes after horse taming.
Yeah.
Dead. But back to
well, and again,
yes.
I was just going to say, sorry, the internet connection was a bit slow there, so sorry for interrupting, but just to say, it's again one of those moments where you see the palimpsest, as someone as critic has called it, the palimpsest, or many palimpsests better, that lie behind the Iliad. So of course, famously, the Iliad doesn't show the fall of Troy. It's silent about the fall of Troy, and the reasons for the fall of Troy. It's something that the Odyssey is going to deal with, very quickly, when Odysseus says, sing one about, the fall of Troy, because, that was me, kind of. The Iliad doesn't do that, but you get hints, with the death of Hector and the people of Troy grieve and lament as if Troy was burning. Cassandra, of course, the first to see Hector, and Priam bringing Hector's body back, but mentioning Cassandra at the end, it's That's also, looking forward. She, of course, looks forward. And that last line, absolutely right. I hadn't noticed it. Typical. The horse, horse taming Hector. Now the tamer has gone, the horse is coming. And I mean, just again, the use of the epithet, and a very traditional, the traditional element of Homeric epic, or sorry, of a hexameter epic more generally, and yet there with this extra charge, it's doing extra work. It's being used in a particular way to look forward to the end that the Iliad doesn't represent, but it's always there, kind of lurking in the background. Very nice. I might have to use that.
Thank you. My brain is like a child's brain in many ways. It goes, what? What about that? Or what about?
It's best to have a child's brain.
Thank you.
Open, curious,
Yay,
constantly looking
children's
for something.
brain. This is why I teach high schoolers because I can relate. I'm just like, oh yeah. Um, so back to that if you could the minute, right, the swift, not swift,
Yeah.
the short-lived Achilles now, as opposed to the opening line, son of Peleus, which recalls his humanity rather than
Yeah, that's
being
right.
the son of a Titan. Now, again, before we were recording, I talked about how I always I view the Iliad in many ways. One, as an anti-war epic. Everything about it to me screams anti-war, not pro-war whatsoever. But also, Homer didn't like the Olympians because whenever he talks about the gods, they're always doing something awful. Um, and yet, the hero is the son of a Titan rather than the son of an Olympian. And that first line it's the son of Peleus who's the recalling his mortality rather than the son of Thetis. But even then, the son of Thetis, he is a Titan and therefore has different concerns than the Olympians. I think I don't know, but that
Well, it's so I was just going to say it's certainly the case again. Yeah, the way that Homer trails the epic, it's there. Once you start looking, it's there what this epic is about. It's about mortality. So that's, it's Achilles. Thetis is going to be really important in book one, of course, with that direct connection to Zeus. So you've got the gods very prominent in book one and really reinforcing the Dios aspect of Achilles, the divine-like nature of Achilles. But right from line one, we're told where this is going. This is the son of Peleus. And Peleus, it's interesting you should mention this after I've just been talking about that scene between Achilles and Priam, because Peleus is on the lips of Priam. That's Priam's connection to Achilles. Remember your father, Achilles. And Peleus is the great absent presence of the Iliad. He's not there, but he's constantly, or a very important moment is referred to. Odysseus does his, he has a go himself at aping Peleus. Remember Achilles, what your father said to you when you left for Troy. Of course, Odysseus is saying this in order to get Achilles to come back to fight. So he's doing it with an angle, of course, as I guess you could say Priam is. But Peleus is this really important figure to try to appropriate, bringing out that aspect that Achilles is fundamentally aware of, even as early as book 9, when he responds to Odysseus. He knows that his father's there by himself, and he wants more than anything else to go home and to be there with his father and protect him. And by book 24, he's still alive, but he knows he's not going to be alive for much longer. And now that life that Priam is kind of evoking and saying, remember your father, Achilles, you can still go back to him. I've lost my son. Achilles knows he can't go back to his father. And that again is another added gut punch, as it were, for what's going on there. So yeah, another good point.
Well, Elton, we have to wrap this up. Any final thoughts? This was just incredibly wonderful. Thank you so much. I mean, what a great first meeting, and I hope we have several conversations in the future. You wouldn't mind me calling you back to talk about other aspects.
Absolutely, anytime, and I can't wait to hear your music. So I'm absolutely thrilled to play, very, 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 very small part in hopefully helping you find your right musical cues, or the musical cues that are going to work for you. But um, final thoughts. You mentioned Patroclus before, and I think that was again very, I think, insightful to note that sense of friendship that you have, however we want to configure that. The sense of friendship is really palpable, and often, and I think this is again really kind of interesting and perhaps a nice tie-in to that scene between Achilles and Priam. So much goes unsaid when we, after Achilles has said he's not going to fight in book one, and then next time we see him, beginning of book 9, when the embassy turns up, we see Achilles sing about the clay andron, the glories of men. Ironically, when he's put his own glories at stake, the tension there about him possibly going home and having that long life that he really wants, as opposed to the short life with Kleos. So it's interesting he should be singing about the glories of men at that point. And Patroclus is there, listening, waiting, as he is all through that book in book 9. And it's very important in book 11, more or less the center of the epic, when Patroclus speaks back for the first time. What use do you have for me, Achilles? Why do you want to send me to see what's happening with the Achaeans? You've just said you're not going to fight anymore. So that moment when he first speaks back, I think, again, thinking about the speaking back element too. I just want to finish by thinking of that, what's not said being a very important signifier of friendship. The end of the scene between Achilles and Priam, both look at each other in amazement. Thavma, which is having Thavma, being in wonder, which is a kind of wonder you'd have when you see something like like a god or something, and the two men have it for each other. Again, in silence. We're not privy to this. We're not told what's going on, and it just reminds me actually of a production. So going back finally to performance, it reminds me of a production I saw of Hamlet. It was in London with Simon Russell Beale. He was rather unfortunately called the Fat Hamlet, as if Hamlet has to be thin. But again, interesting kind of modern conceptions of what we imagine, the angstful kind of teenager to look like. It has to be thin and drawn. So he was kind of his thing was he was the Fat Hamlet, but an amazing production. And one thing they did, it was the whole Hamlet, which you don't often get. So it's a long sitting. But one thing they did brilliantly was bring out the relationship, the friendship he has with Horatio. And that's really striking when you see Rosencrantz and Guildenstern trying to play Hamlet as friends. You get the response, you're trying to play me, literally. And Horatio is always there, very rarely speaking. The image I want to leave you with is how they, because it's a long play, they split it in two. And you ended the first part of this production with Hamlet and Horatio at the back of the stage, slumped down, kind of next to each other. Then they opened the next, the second half, with the stage reversed. So you now with Hamlet and Horatio with their backs to you in conversation. And it's a conversation the audience is not privy to. So that sense of the very strong bonds between friends was really brought out very nicely in that production. And I can't help thinking about that when I read the scenes between Patroclus and Achilles. Sorry, that was a very long last point. Didn't mean to ramble on.
That was beautiful. Thank you. That's wonderful.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, Okay, and I'm looking forward to the next time we can talk about Homer. Whenever that might be, if you don't.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
Bye, Elton. Bye for now.
Thank you. Thank you, Athena. Thank you.